Now, when The Last of Us debuted in 2013, it certainly had some woke moments, but overall, it was a solid story about a man on a path to redemption.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
At his core, Joel was another version of the road warrior, who himself is a popular male archetype. Now, is it a cliche? Sure, but so is moving to a farm to raise sheep with your homosexual lover.
More? You can tell me to stop.
Snowy. Barn time.
To briefly summarize the first game's plot, in 2013, an outbreak of a mutant cordyceps fungus ravages the United States, transforming its human hosts into aggressive creatures known as the Infected. A man named Joel, living in Texas, flees the chaos with his brother Tommy and daughter Sarah. As they flee, Sarah is shot by a soldier and dies in Joel's arms. 20 years later, civilization has been decimated by the infection. Joel is now a hardened, bitter man working as a smuggler with his partner Tess in a Boston quarantine zone. Together they hunt down a black market dealer who had stolen a weapons cache from them. The dealer reveals that he traded the cache with the Fireflies, a rebel militia opposing the quarantine zone authorities. The leader of the Fireflies, Marlene, shows up and offers to hand over the cache if Tess and Joel smuggle a teenage girl named Ellie to the Massachusetts State House. Joel and Tess accept the offer and set out for the State House with the girl in tow. But after an encounter with a government patrol, they discover that Ellie is infected. Full infection normally occurs in under 2 days, but Ellie claims she was infected 3 weeks earlier and that her immunity may lead to a cure. Upon arriving at the State House, however, they discover that all the Fireflies there are dead. Tess then reveals that she's been bitten by an infected, and believing in Ellie's importance, persuades Joel to do whatever it takes to get Ellie to the Fireflies. She then sacrifices herself against pursuing soldiers so that Joel and Ellie can escape. Over the course of the following year, Ellie and Joel form an unbreakable bond that masterfully plays out via dialogue, narrative, and even game mechanics. Once in the vicinity of the Salt Lake City Hospital, where a Firefly outpost is said to be located, Ellie is rendered unconscious after almost drowning, and Joel is knocked out by Fireflies on patrol. He awakens later to be told by Marlene that Ellie is being prepped for a surgery to remove the cordyceps mutation from her brain. The procedure, he's told, could lead to a vaccine, but will kill her in the process. Joel then strongly protests, at which point Marlene orders him to be removed from the building. Joel breaks free and battles his way through the hospital. He kills the surgeon, rescues Ellie, and then escapes. On the drive out of the city, Ellie wakes up but has no idea what happened from the point where she almost drowned. Joel then claims that the Fireflies had found many other immune people, but were ultimately unable to create a cure. They then return to a settlement in Wyoming where Joel's brother lives. Ellie expresses doubt about Joel's accounting of the events and demands that he swear it's all true. He does, she says okay, and the credits roll with the sentiment that Joel had concealed the truth in order to protect her. The sequel begins about 4 years later. Ellie, who's now 19, is still living in Jackson, Wyoming. Seeking revenge, Abby, the daughter of the surgeon Joel killed, leads a group of ex-Fireflies to the town's outskirts. Upon seeing how large the town is, her companions consider turning back. Angered by this, she storms off by herself and gets into trouble. She's about to be killed by an infected when, by sheer luck, Joel and his brother stumble upon her while out on patrol. Unaware of her hostile intentions, they save her. Then, as the storm approaches, she offers the two to hold up at her nearby camp. Once there, she shoots Joel in the leg with a shotgun, her friends apply a tourniquet, and she proceeds to beat him with a golf club. During all of this, Ellie and Dina, her bisexual Jewish girlfriend, are themselves out on patrol as the same storm approaches. They take shelter in a library, where they stumble upon a weed farm of all things. The two then decide to get high and make out. Then, during their pillow talk session, Jesse, Dina's Asian ex-boyfriend, shows up and tells them that Joel and Tommy are missing. The three split up to search. Ellie arrives at Abby's camp in time to witness Abby smash Joel's head in. Then the group decides not to kill Ellie or Joel's brother and instead knocks them out and leaves. From here, the sequel's plot feels like a straightforward story about revenge, until the halfway point when everything switches to the perspective of Joel's killer, Abby, and uses cheap emotional tricks on you in an effort to reveal the humanity of your enemies. As the game's director, Neil Druckmann, put it, the game is, quote, a commentary about the cycle of violence. Throughout the experience, Naughty Dog repeatedly forces guilt on the player via scripted actions that, even from Ellie's perspective, had fairly clear justification. For example, when Ellie breaks into Abby's hideout, Abby's dog attacks her, and hurdy-dur-dur-dur, Ellie defends herself. The second half of the game spends no small amount of time guilting you for having done this via warm interactions with the same dog from Abby's perspective. Then, when Ellie confronts two of Abby's friends in the same building, they attack her, and hurdy-dur-dur-dur, she defends herself. But the woman who tries to stab her turns out to be pregnant, and Ellie loses her mind over it. Now, of course, any normal person would feel terrible after having killed a pregnant woman. Well, maybe not. Abby at one point is literally about to gleefully and knowingly murder a pregnant woman until her friend's protest stops her.
She's pregnant. Good. Abby.
Even putting aside the game's woke agendas, many of the new characters are simply poorly written, are unlikable, and lack any serious amount of depth, which ruin the experience since the goal was to make players feel bad for having hurt them. By the time I fought Ellie with Abby's avatar, I just wanted Ellie to kill me. It felt terrible having to fight a character whom I had far more attachment to. Earlier in the game, Abby tracks Ellie down after learning that Ellie had killed her friends. She shoots Jesse in the face, thereby killing one of the more likable characters, which made me hate her even more. Then, despite the fact that Joel had saved Abby's life, Abby cries to Ellie about the fact that she and her friends had let Ellie live after they killed Joel.
We let you both live, and you wasted it.
This line echoes what Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, had uttered to Joel in the first game, when she was forcing him to leave the facility after he questioned the morality of letting his adopted daughter die on a surgical table because some guy he never met said it would save the world.
Don't waste this gift, Joel.
The idea here is that Ellie, like Joel, should have walked away. Abby's mercy was a gift to Ellie, just as Ellie's sacrifice would have been a gift to humanity. To quote an article about the game's Jewish themes that Druckmann himself shared on social media, quote, if Ellie had taken any advice during the game, it would have been best for her to take the advice of the synagogue's rabbi, who left a letter in a desk about how he had to evacuate the synagogue at the start of the outbreak. It's sad to be forced from your home, he wrote, but in the end, it's the living people that matter. Jews throughout history have learned this. The Last of Us Part 2 might have been very different had Ellie learned it too, unquote. Curiously, Druckmann spent his childhood in the West Bank, an area of Palestinian territory that is actively being annexed by Israeli settlements. And yet, the inspiration for the theme of cyclical violence actually came from a personal trauma he suffered after he moved to the US in 1989. In an article about the game's development, journalist Sam White recounts some of his conversations with Druckmann. Quote, it was while living in the US that he also suffered a personal trauma of his own, one that would eventually become the inspiration for the game. I don't want to go into specifics about it, but I saw a video of a lynching when I was much younger, he recalls. It's a memory we discussed several times throughout my visits. It was like a news thing.
No.
And then, feeling intense hatred for the people that committed the lynching and thinking like, oh man, if I could hurt these people in some horrible ways, then I could. While fleshing out the story of Part 2 and reflecting on his childhood, on the universality of tribalism, the othering of minorities, and the justification of atrocities, he began to explore the themes of retribution, revenge, and justice. I was like, oh, we can make the player feel that, he says. We can make you experience this thirst for revenge, this thirst for retribution, and having you actually, commit the acts of finding it, and then showing you the other side to make you regret it. To make you feel dirty for everything you've done in the game, making you realize, I'm actually the villain of the story, unquote. Now, Druckmann had a great opportunity with this game to draw on his experiences as an Israeli Jew to have an honest conversation about the Jewish contribution to the Palestinian conflict, and more broadly to how Jews themselves contribute to cycles of violence, vengeance, and persecution. Instead, all you get are tropes about Jews being the eternal victims and praises for being the ultimate survivors.
Hey, Ellie. This place is a synagogue.
How can you tell?
One, there are menorah decorations on the wall. It's a Jewish thing. And two, I didn't burst into flames just now, so... My sister used to drag me to a synagogue all the time.
You never struck me as much of a believer.
Nah. But I like coming from a long line of survivors.
You mean after Outbreak Day?
That, and the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. My family always made it out alive. Barely. Jewish holidays are all about food. And celebrating not getting annihilated by our enemies.
A long line of survivors.
Exactly.
The same Jewish article that Druckmann shared on Twitter emphasizes that, quote, "These conversations aren't hidden away in a part of the game you can easily miss. Going through the synagogue is part of the main objective," unquote. The author then expounds upon how, like Dina, Judaism gives her a connection to her ancestors and that, quote, "No matter how many things change in the world, Judaism has endured," unquote. But in addition to being victims, the Jews have also historically committed genocide, conquest, and have held millennia-old grudges and sought vengeance numerous times against their enemies.
This is truly a promised land. Look at it. So green and fertile.
They are not marching. He says they have stopped for a special ritual they call Passover.
And what sort of ritual is that?
Since Dina mentioned food, Hamantash is a Jewish food eaten during the holiday of Purim that celebrates the killing of Haman, a historical enemy of the Jews. In Israel, the food is actually called Onsei Haman, meaning Haman's ears. The Jews are actually some of the most vengeful people on the planet, and yet despite Druckmann's theme about cyclical violence and vengeance, he never once addresses this aspect of Jewish behavior. He could easily have done so with some sort of offhanded comment from Dina, or perhaps even the inclusion of a Palestinian character. He and other developers at Naughty Dog have repeatedly stated that they believe diversity makes their stories better. In fact, they took the liberty of making Jackson, Wyoming quite ethnically diverse. Now, technically, Jackson County doesn't exist, and neither does the town in the game, but it's clearly based off of the Jackson of Teton County, Wyoming. According to the 2013 census, the year of the outbreak in the Last of Us timeline, Jackson had 9,777 inhabitants. The racial makeup was 6,655 whites, 228 Asians, 255 non-Hispanic persons of mixed race, 56 Native Americans, and 2 African Americans. The remaining 2,581 persons were Hispanic. Thus, 26% of the population was Hispanic, while 68% was white. The remaining 6% was mostly Asians and Native Americans. Moreover, most of the Hispanics were probably recent migrants, who would have fled home to their families in Mexico after the outbreak. Although the outbreak supposedly began in Central America, so maybe not. Either way, you don't see a bunch of Mexicans in Jackson. You see an absurd amount of black people. Now, what's remarkable about the game's theme of cyclical violence is that the game goes out of its way to avoid a direct depiction of ethnic conflict. Each faction has a carefully curated amount of diversity. However, this simply isn't how reality works. Just as a Middle Eastern region comprised of various ethnicities devolves into ethnic conflict once the government falls apart, the same thing would happen after a collapse in the US. Towns would not have equally distributed diversity, and women certainly wouldn't be roaming the countryside as warriors equal to men.
I actually cleared you for active duty. Barely.
And yet, a major plot point in the game is the genocide of a religious cult on a nearby island. Now again, since each faction involved has a carefully curated amount of diversity, we technically can't call this ethnic cleansing, even though that's the idea, which is why at one point Abby is portrayed as virtuous for defending a member of the island's cult. She's taking a stand against ethnic cleansing and siding with the oppressed over her own people, who are now the oppressors.
Oh my god, she's gone. Come on. Those were your fucking people. You're my people.
Surprisingly, the idea to kill all the cultists was that of a black man, Isaac. Perhaps this dovetails into why some reviewers have been disturbed by the level of violence in the game. As one person at Kotaku put it, the game's diversity, quote, felt like an equal opportunity for different kinds of people to suffer as the game went on, unquote. It's almost as if the person who wrote this felt like some groups should suffer more than others. Putting that aside though, Isaac's semi-villainous nature really had nothing to do with his racial identity, but it's still surprising that Naughty Dog had the courage to depict a black man negatively in 2020. On the other hand, Isaac is the leader of the most powerful army in the northwestern United States, which is about to ethnically cleanse an entire island of anti-LGBT, bigoted religious fanatics. The cult itself is very one-dimensional. It's an inconsistent caricature of how religions have historically attributed things like famines and environmental disasters to sin or the use of technology. The Jewish article Druckmann cited discusses this. Unsurprisingly, however, the author excludes Judaism from that sort of analysis, and praises Naughty Dog's depiction of Judaism as a grounding, calming force for Dina's character, but then points out that the game doesn't shy away from the evils of religion. The evil Seraphites, as she calls them, quote, think if they can get rid of all sin, the zombies will go away and society can go back to normal. Their belief, too, gives them a sense of purpose and control in a frightening world. There are a lot of morally gray factions in Part 2, but this isn't one of them. The Seraphites show how religion can go too far when that is all you rely on in the world, unquote. Now, there's nothing outright damning about what she says here, but it does contribute to the revelation that Druckmann was more interested in holding up Judaism and praising it in comparison to a morally corrupt straw man than he was in any sort of honest self-criticism. This seems like, dare I say, a kosher approach to tackling the themes of cyclical violence. To a certain extent, I suspect that the Seraphites are partially concealed meta-commentary on historical Judeo-Christian hostilities. The cult builds off tropes of religious conservatives being anti-science who resort to evil behavior when faced with obstacles and social change. But the framing is often confused. Lev is a transgender boy whose childhood dream to be a soldier, just like her sister, Yara, was shattered when she was promised as a wife to an elder. Against her sister's advice, she shaves her head and changes her name from Lily to Lev. In response, the cult declares both sisters apostates and continuously tries to murder them. So the cult was progressive enough to allow females to become warriors, but mindlessly bigoted enough to want to murder both of them after one of them shaved their head.
Do you regret shaving your head?
We're not supposed to have regrets.
Overall, the game conveys the idea that religions go too far, well, except for Judaism, which is a grounding force that keeps Jews' pristine vestiges of moral certitude.
Remember next time there's kids around.
Yeah, like you're setting such a great example.
There's another interesting article on the series that Druckmann also shared on Twitter, calling it a thoughtful reflection. It articulates how the sequel deconstructs and views Joel's actions in the first game. The author writes, quote, Joel grew to love Ellie so much that, by the end of the first game, he's willing to essentially let the world burn to save her, unquote. The author highlights that, quote, Joel doomed millions of people to death, but on a more personal level, he sent Ellie and Abby on their own paths of self-destruction, tragically altering their lives forever, unquote. He goes on to call Joel's actions twisted, selfish, and unjustifiable, but notes that in Joel's mind, he was doing right by Ellie, the person he loved most. Indeed, upon finding out that he lied to her, Ellie becomes intensely angry at Joel for saving her. Although not intended as such, it really came off as a teenage temper tantrum, and, like a good father, Joel regretted nothing.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
Quote, how could he feel this way, knowing this decision cost so many lives and ultimately cost Ellie her innocence, unquote. Well, the idea that Joel's decision cost Ellie her innocence is a bit absurd. This is a girl who was almost raped and had to kill dozens of people to survive. And just so we're clear, all of those people, in theory, would have had their own sob story to tell as well.
You kill to survive. And so do we. We have to take care of our own, by any means necessary.
Now, I understand the idea here that even noble actions can have negative consequences, but it's exceedingly twisted to depict a father's unconditional love for his child as unjustifiable. The article here is marketed as being about how love conquers all, but in reality, it's about how Joel's love for Ellie caused everyone around him pain. Even the author highlights that the entire second game revolves around the fateful moment when Joel decided to save Ellie. He calls it, quote, the anchor point for the entire saga, unquote. Another review that Druckmann has also approvingly shared is one by a YouTuber named Girlfriend Reviews, and it too echoes the same basic view that maybe Joel was the villain.
Seattle Day 1 through 3 for Ellie is a progression of increasingly horrendous acts, accompanied by a story told through flashbacks that represent her increasingly horrendous mental state. These memories go from the best of times to the worst of times that she shared with Joel, climaxing with the revelation that he lied to her about what happened at the end of the previous game. Joel murdered the doctors searching for a cure, and in Ellie's own words, prevented her life from meaning something. When we learn that she has been struggling with the same morally ambiguous actions of a grief-stricken man that we as players have struggled with for so many years, we are forced to confront a grim possibility. Maybe, just maybe, Joel lived long enough to see himself become the villain, at least in someone else's story. And maybe, just maybe, in that story, he had it coming. In the present day, as a grief-stricken Ellie slowly becomes a more terrifying monster than some of the literal monsters, her friends begin to question if revenge is worth it, the player begins to question if revenge is worth it, and after her rage results in the death of a nearly born child, Ellie finally decides she's okay with letting Abby live if it means getting her loved ones back home safe.
The idea that Ellie's life ultimately had no meaning because she didn't die on a surgical table is abominable. She could get married, have her own children, begin the process of passing on her immunity to future generations. But of course, that would require her to make a sacrifice since she's a lesbian. And I suppose in the moral framework of 2020, it's far more noble to die on a surgical table than it is to suffer pregnancy and motherhood. Sure, if we take the Firefly's promise of being able to make a vaccine and save the world at face value, then from a pragmatic standpoint, yes, the right thing to do would have been to let Ellie die on that table. But the entire winter sequence of the first game was Ellie defending Joel while he was unconscious, which was purposefully mirrored in Joel's fight to save Ellie from the operating table while she was unconscious. It's also not a coincidence that Abby's story likewise mirrors Joel's. Like Joel, she lost someone close, became a hardened shell of her former self, but then found meaning again by adopting an orphaned girl. Just as the first game set up a framework to justify Joel's killing of the Fireflies to save Ellie, the sequel sets up a framework to justify Abby's saving of Lev. But whereas Joel grew a paternal attachment to Ellie over months of traveling with her across the nation, Abby guns down hordes of her own people to save some kid she's barely known for a few days. It's a flat, poor attempt to replace the meaningful relationship between Joel and Ellie. So to summarize, Joel is now the villain because after he lost his biological daughter, spent the next 20 years living in misery, reluctantly learned to be a father again to a little girl who herself had fought vigorously to keep him alive, didn't just walk away and let her die after Marlene, a woman he barely knew, claimed some doctor he hadn't even met was going to save the world. Curiously, even the aforementioned rabbi, whose note Ellie found in a desk, suggests that Joel had a responsibility to save her because she was a living person. As one of the articles Druckmann shared states, for Joel, quote, "Home is wherever Ellie is," unquote. The same author capitalizes on how the ending credits plays the wayfaring stranger and talks about how Joel and Abby have, metaphorically, crossed over the River Jordan to the Promised Land. According to the Christian faith, as he states, quote, "The Israelites crossed the River Jordan to make it to the Promised Land. It's also where Jesus was baptized, washed of sin." Joel and Abby seem to have made their way across the rapids, and perhaps Ellie has yet to make it to the other side. But at least now she's moving in the right direction, unquote. Now, what direction is that? Well, it's one without a link to Joel. It's one where she washes herself of his sin. Throughout the story, Joel's guitar serves as an emotional link between the two, but her path to vengeance gets her fingers bit off by the same girl who killed Joel. Thus, her ability to play and her link to Joel are severed. Now, this is depicted as a statement about how vengeance destroys love, which would seem to contradict the idea that the story is about how love conquers hate. But really, why write a sequel that destroys a previously celebrated relationship between a father and a daughter?
Naughty Dog's intention for making you play as two separate characters with two separate stories was to cause a complete loss of subjective self-identity when their timelines merge.
We are sowing uncertainty. We are warring on their minds.
So, we wage war on their minds. And meanwhile, I am rapidly losing my own.
Color me surprised that an Israeli, born into a colonialist settlement in the West Bank, ethnically cleansing Palestinians, moved to the country that saved his people and gave him a homeland to teach them a lesson about how to end cyclical violence via the loss of subjective self-identity. As the author of the Jewish article Druckmann cited stated, quote, "In real life, Jews have suffered centuries of discrimination and violence," unquote. The thing is, according to Druckmann's own theme of cause and effect leading into cyclical violence, there must be a reason for this. Rather than explore the Jewish contribution, however, he ignored its existence entirely, and instead placed a white Christian man squarely at the center of a world of suffering.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that.
In a way, the sequel's theme isn't cyclical violence. It's that a father's love for his child is selfish and leads to pain. So, a few things have come to my attention since making my video on The Last of Us Part 2, and I decided that I needed to address them. First off, I got something wrong. The GQ magazine article I cited had heavily implied that the lynching Neil Druckmann witnessed had occurred in the United States. However, a more recent Washington Post piece reveals that said lynching was in fact the killing of 2 IDF soldiers by a crowd of angry Palestinians in Ramallah. Quote, "The formulation for Ellie's turn toward darkness can be traced back to the year 2000. Then, in his early 20s, Druckmann witnessed news footage of a crowd lynching 2 Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. And then they cheered afterward," Druckmann, who grew up in Israel, recalls. "It was the cheering that was really chilling to me. In my mind, I thought, oh man, if I could just push a button and kill all these people that committed this horrible act, I would make them feel the same pain that they inflicted on these people," unquote.
Israeli bombing in Gaza has intensified, with the Palestinian death toll now reaching more than 500, mostly civilians.
Now, to be clear, I didn't intend to misrepresent this. The original GQ article states that, quote, "It was while living in the US that he also suffered a personal trauma of his own, one that eventually became the inspiration for the game," unquote. Then Druckmann opted to not share any further details, and he used the word lynching. Without further clarification, in an American setting, most Americans will immediately associate a lynching with the hanging of a black person by a white mob. This is why in my original video I inserted a clip of Jonathan Frakes from Beyond Belief, because I very much doubted that Druckmann had witnessed the hanging of a black man in the US. In any event, I think Druckmann and the author should have made it abundantly clear that they were not referencing white-on-black mob violence, especially considering the current political climate. Curiously, Druckmann revealed this vague lynching story to the press just a few weeks before the game's initial release. Then, in early July, a few weeks after release, he began to qualify it. What I suspect, but ultimately can't prove, is that he did this to capitalize on the death of George Floyd. It's of note that Druckmann himself has admitted to outright lying to consumers.
What was the first question?
Joel, alive or dead?
It depends at which point. Everybody dies at some point.
Wow. Hey, guys! Quick reminder of mortality, just in case you haven't thought about it.
The worst way that this game could be presented already happened. Like our worst fear. Because we did so much to try to protect the story, right? Including putting fake shots in trailers and swapping skins on characters and recording a different line with Troy.
Yeah, you sons of bitches. I came back from that preview event. I'm like, they're like, no, I think no, he's going to die. I'm like, he's not going to die. I just saw him. He grabbed me. He grabbed Ellie. He's fine.
To put this into perspective, fans had expressed concern about Joel being dead as early as 2016, and yet Naughty Dog went out of its way to convince them that he was still alive, using extremely misleading character swaps in trailers and altered photos.
What the hell are you doing here?
I think I'd let you do this on your own. You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Now, I don't necessarily have an issue with manipulating an audience for effect, but this should probably be limited to within the artistic medium itself, and not be part of a marketing campaign. In any event, the game is exceedingly political in terms of social justice. It begins with an old man apologizing to Ellie for taking issue with her and Dina making out in front of children.
Seth's got something he wants to say to you. I don't want to hear what that bigot has to say. Do it for me, please.
Last night, I was drinking too much.
Sure.
I'm trying to say I'm sorry. Made you some sandwiches.
Okay.
For steak.
Thank you, Seth.
What you got there?
Bigot sandwiches.
Smells good.
The game doesn't stop here either, with endless homosexual themes. Ellie and Dina literally move to a secluded farm where they raise sheep, and there's even a gay bookstore complete with a novel's description that plays on cliché tropes about the male inability to satisfy the female sexual appetite. To a certain extent, the book description plays off Dina's Jewish role in the game. Let's take a look at the dance scene where Ellie and Dina first kiss.
Every guy in this room is staring at you right now. Maybe they're staring at you. Or not. Maybe they're jealous of you. I'm just a girl, not a threat.
Oh, Ellie. I think they should be terrified.
The insinuation here is that all the boys were jealous of Ellie because she was able to garner the attention of the town's glorious Jewess, who was the object of their ravenous lust. Then by the end of the game, Ellie is emotionally distraught precisely because her quest for vengeance has caused her to lose Dina and miss out on raising someone else's baby. The game really wants the player to see Dina as something special. She's not only the love of Ellie's life, but she's also Ellie's moral compass that Ellie ignored, resulting in her current mental anguish. Because Ellie couldn't let go of her father, who, as the game highlights, had deeply wronged her anyway, she ended up losing Dina. As the rabbi's letter in the synagogue stated, it's the living people who matter. In other words, it's Dina and her baby who matter, not Joel, who's already dead. To be clear, I'm not taking issue with a woman moving on after her father's death. While I didn't write Joel's character, my impression is that he'd want Ellie to walk away. He'd want her to survive. The issue I have here is the very particular and self-serving Jewish framing. For example, the rabbi's letter likens having to leave his synagogue in the midst of a zombie epidemic to fleeing the Nazis in Germany 80 years earlier. But this might have something to do with how the game frames other discussions. Vice magazine is typically not something I'm very fond of, but recently they put out an interesting piece on the not-so-hidden Israeli politics of The Last of Us Part 2. While I do take issue with some of the sentiments outlined within, overall it does highlight just how many parallels The Last of Us Part 2 has with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First off, the structures and walls in the quarantine zones have an uncanny resemblance to those found in Israel. Beyond that, the WLF is basically a proxy for the IDF. The Washington Liberation Front carried out terrorist attacks against Fedra to take over Seattle proper, and this mirrors how early Zionists took over British-controlled Palestine during the 1940s. After World War II, there was a Jewish insurgency in Palestine that carried out violent attacks against the British authorities, including the bombing of the King David Hotel and an actual lynching wherein Jews captured, hung, and then booby-trapped the bodies of 2 British soldiers.
They were kidnapped, kept in a dungeon for weeks, and then strangled, and their corpses hung in a eucalyptus grove and booby-trapped to injure their mates when they took them down. The Second World War had just ended when these vicious attacks were taking place. British soldiers had fought 6 long years to defeat Adolf Hitler. The Adolf Hitler who allegedly murdered 6 million Jews. And then came what can only be described as the Jewish stab in the back for those British soldiers.
Moreover, just as the Washington Liberation Front had to deal with a Seraphite insurgency after having kicked out Fedra, in real life the IDF had to deal with a Palestinian insurgency after having expelled the British. It's also interesting how the Scars use bridges and walkways on the Seattle skyscrapers to bypass WLF patrols and blockades. This seems like an inverted parallel of Palestinian tunnels in Israel.
Israeli leaders have identified this growing network of tunnels as the main target of the ongoing offensive in Gaza, which they say will not stop until the tunnels are finally dealt with.
Also, as Vice notes, later in the game, Ellie finds a location called Martyr Gate, where the Scar's spiritual leader apparently died, indicating a religious significance of a specific and disputed location, and emphasizing the notion of martyrdom as central to their culture. I would highlight here that the WLF is never depicted as having any sense of martyrdom or religious fanaticism, and yet Judaism has celebrated martyrdom just as much as any Palestinian. Israelis to this very day celebrate the siege of Masada, wherein 960 Jewish men, women, and children committed mass suicide rather than submit to Roman rule. It's one of Israel's most popular tourist attractions and is a potent symbol for the Israeli Defense Force.
I'm from Boston, 27. Today is the Masa Komta. I can't believe it, but we made it all the way here right now to Masada.
The Vice magazine article also references a podcast in which Druckmann himself reveals that Israeli politics indeed had a deep influence on even the first game.
I'm originally from Israel, so I follow a lot of Israeli politics, and there was this guy, Gilad Shalit, a soldier who was kidnapped and held prisoner for years by Hamas, and then there was an exchange of hundreds of prisoners for this one soldier. And some of the prisoners that were exchanged had blood on their hands, like committed horrible terrorist acts. And there was a big debate in Israel, was it right to exchange so many people that were in prison for this one soldier to bring him back? And I remember I talked with my dad about it, and I'm like, what do you think? Do you think that was the right decision? And he says, are you asking me as the soldier's dad or as the Prime Minister of Israel? Because I would make two very different decisions. As the Prime Minister of Israel, I think they made the wrong decision. I think they're now less safe because they made this thing. As the guy's dad, I would have traded every prisoner in every prison for this guy. And that's really what the story's about. Did the ends justify the means? And it's really so much about perspective. If it was maybe to save a strange kid versus a family, maybe Joel would have made a very different decision. But when it was his tribe, his daughter, there was no question about what he's going to do.
Oh, whatever. Philistine.
And now white people need to advocate for themselves. That's not, you talk about history, not a healthy recipe.
No.
Not a healthy recipe. We need to go back to this idea that people are individuals,
So per Druckmann's analogy here, when Joel saves Ellie, he's representative of Druckmann's own father, theoretically freeing every prisoner in Israel. Marlene is the prime minister, choosing to sacrifice Ellie for the greater good of Israel. But I'm not sure if Israelis sacrificing one of their soldiers for the greater good of the Jewish nation in its fight against the Palestinians scales so well as an analogy for the greater good of humanity as it's understood within the Joel shall let Ellie die to create a vaccine to save the world paradigm. First off, in order for this analogy to work, the Palestinians would have to be seen as the cordyceps fungus and the Jews as humanity. Moreover, I very much doubt that Druckmann seriously entertains the idea that Gilad Shalit's father is a murderer and that his son's life has no meaning today because he didn't die in a Hamas dungeon.
Think about what he did. How many people are dead because of him?
Second, Joel had no tribe, quote-unquote, in a Jews versus Palestinians sense. There was no shared history or cycle of violence between him and the Fireflies. Joel was an individual father saving his individual daughter from strangers who had just knocked him out and then refused to even have a discussion about Ellie's fate. If Druckmann really wanted to explore the particular moral dilemma he outlined in the podcast, then why did he choose a white Christian father as the anchor point and then prop up an overtly Jewish character as the game's moral compass in the foreground of veiled, one-sided critiques of Palestinians? The game seems to have one message for Jews and another one for Gentiles. Something else the game's rabbi said in the letter was quite poignant in this regard. Quote, "It takes but one candle to dispel the darkness," unquote. This coincides fairly well with the Firefly slogan of, "When you're lost in the darkness, look for the light."
When you're lost in the darkness, look for the light.
Both Judaism and the Fireflies in the sequel are portrayed as the light and the darkness of the world. The tattoo Ellie has over her bite mark is a moth. Moths are attracted to light, which, in Ellie's case, is both the Fireflies and Dina.
We traveled across the entire country to bring me to the Fireflies. I had so many questions for them. Why did you pull me out of there while I was still unconscious? I love you.
Prove it. Stay.
With this in mind, here's an outline of one of the potential proxy narratives sloshing about in the game's psyche. The Fireflies, associated with Judaism, were attempting to save the world when Joel, a white Christian man, showed up and massacred them all. Afterwards, Abby and many of the survivors fled to the Washington Liberation Front in Seattle, which is strongly associated with the IDF in the Levant. So here we have the typical diaspora narrative. The Jews were doing their own thing when a goy showed up and forced them to disperse. Also bear in mind that the entire second half of the sequel is meant to erode the player's hatred of these Fireflies, who are now part of the WLF. While it does arguably portray the WLF in a bad light at times, you're meant to walk away feeling more attached to Abby and have a sense of guilt for having killed her father and her friends. That said, the fact that Abby saves Lev is interesting when viewed from this angle, because Abby is, in this context anyway, an Israeli saving a Palestinian from the IDF. And yet somehow I doubt that Druckmann is signaling to members of the IDF to rebel against their commanding officers and start killing their fellow Israelis. Superficially, Abby probably resonates more with white social justice advocates, and in that regard, her actions encourage them to further abandon their own tribe in favor of outgroups. As I stated in my last video, Abby and Lev's relationship is pretty much meant to replace the entire Joel-Ellie paradigm of a traditional white father and daughter with a butch she-man and a transgender Asian. Now, while the game does end with the Seraphite Island completely on fire, the message seems to be that the ethnic, but not really ethnic violence has ended in the symmetric decimation of both sides. But as Vice magazine highlights, imagining this process as some kind of symmetric cycle benefits one side more than the other, and a defining feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the macabre bargaining over which violence is worse. The Seraphites are, again, exceedingly one-dimensional, and their religion is shown as the cause for their troubles, whereas Judaism is depicted as a calm, guiding force that simply enables Jews to survive Gentile hostility.
A long line of survivors.
Exactly.
Moreover, the WLF is a secular community who, aside from their problems with the Seraphites, are seen as healthy, rational actors, and their villainy arises mostly as a response to the continued threats the Seraphite identity poses to them. Now, there are moments in the game when Dina criticizes the WLF, but putting aside the fact that she's overtly Jewish while the WLF is not, I can't help but draw an analogy between her character and a liberal diaspora Jew who asserts that Judaism and Zionism are completely divorced from one another and that the former doesn't inform the latter. To an extent, the narrative actually presents the ethnic cleansing of the Seraphites as regrettable, but necessary. Or at the very least, it presents the WLF as having their hands tied in the matter.
Can't keep going like this. Then what? We could try another truce. But how long before some asshole on their side or our side unravels the whole thing? No. It has to be all of them.
Sure, the game does assign some guilt to both sides, but the proxy narrative ignores the fact that the Jews are the ones building settlements on Palestinian territory. And to be clear, the WLF is not building settlements on the Seraphites' island. In fact, according to the game's lore, the Seraphites chose to move to the island after Fedra was defeated, at which point the elders in the community grew hostile towards the WLF, and waged war with them for control of the forest areas. The game makes no attempt to portray the fact that, in real life, the so-called WLF expelled 700,000 so-called Seraphites from their homes in 1948, and then relentlessly continued to annex more and more of their territory.
Every May 14th, the Israelis celebrate the creation of their state, while the following day, Palestinian refugees and their children commemorate the Nakba.
As the game depicts the situation, the Seraphite religion sprang up a few years after the outbreak when people began to follow a religious fanatic in the city who preached that mankind's fall to the cordyceps brain infection was brought on by their own sin and efforts to live in a machine-dependent world. Not only is all this an anti-Christian trope of blaming calamities on sin and technology, but it also deprives the Palestinian people of a legitimate identity. As much as some Jews want to believe it's the case, the Palestinians didn't just appear after World War II. They've been living in the Levant for thousands of years, and their current majority religion, Islam, dates back over 1,000 years. Moreover, the WLF doesn't receive billions of dollars in aid and armaments from Fedra every year, and the Palestinians don't lack sophisticated weaponry and live in squalor because of some warped religious belief. The game has an odd way of continually suggesting that the Seraphites suffer because they choose to adhere to a bunch of silly ideas. At one point, Lev, a transgender boy being hunted by her fellow Seraphites for having shaved her head and having refused to marry a village elder, sneaks back to the Seraphite island to convince her mother to leave the cult. Ultimately, however, her mother is consumed by religious zealotry and attacks Lev, who is then forced to kill her in self-defense. Yara and Abby, who had followed Lev to the island, then come across the gruesome scene. Yara reassures her sister that she's done nothing wrong, which I really wouldn't disagree with at face value, but Yara's indifference to her mother's death seemed a bit strange considering the game had spent no small amount of time by this point attempting to guilt the player for, of all things, having killed one of the WLF's dogs. Now, let that sink in a minute. The game literally spends more time lamenting the death of a dog than it does the dead mother of a Seraphite girl. Moreover, whereas Ellie and Abby had spent the entire game at this point in endless anguish over their dead fathers, Yara and Lev seemed to move past, with relative ease, the fact that Lev murdered her own mother. The game seemed to suggest that her life mattered less than a dog's because she was a bigot.
She did this. I just tried talking to her. I tried to make her understand. And she just kept yelling.
Take it outside! If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a f***ing sir!
I apologize. I apologize now.
In any event, the word Seraphite is derived from the Seraphim, which are angelic divinities within all three Abrahamic traditions, but are most strongly associated with Christianity. Now, they're certainly a part of Judaism, as they did appear in the book of Isaiah, but they aren't as important or symbolic. Without getting into too much detail, the Seraphim are associated with the purification of sin, which is exactly what the Seraphites are doing when they disembowel trespassers onto their island. Now, to be frank, I suspect that this is a reference to Druckmann's lynching, wherein the Palestinians in Ramallah killed and then supposedly disemboweled 2 IDF soldiers trespassing onto Palestinian territory. Now, some people will say that it's clearly a reference to Japanese seppuku, and maybe it is, but the fact that it's a punishment for trespassing makes me think otherwise. The grotesque use of ritual disembowelment on trespassers is probably meant to cause the player to despise the Seraphites as irrational actors. While players are meant to sympathize with Yara and Lev, even though they're Seraphites, it's because they're victims of their cult's religious fanaticism. Again, the idea here is that the Seraphites suffer because of their Seraphite identity. And again, contrast this with the way the game overtly praises Judaism as a morally sound and legitimate identity. Considering this game was supposed to teach a universal lesson, it sure does seem one-sided. After the confrontation between Ellie and Abby at the theater, which resulted in Ellie and Abby temporarily giving up their vengeance quests, Dina and Ellie are living on a farm when Joel's brother Tommy pays them a visit. Not only is his eye missing from his encounter with Abby in the theater, thus revealing that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, but he also tells us that he's now divorced from his wife. He then informs Ellie that he's once again found out where Abby is. Ellie reluctantly says that she won't continue to pursue Abby, at which point Tommy tries to guilt her. Then the righteous Dina chews him out for trying to drag Ellie back into the cycle of violence.
Reckon it's easy. Forget about her. You sitting all comfy way out here?
Hey.
I'll make her pay.
Tommy.
That's what you said when we got back to Jackson.
Tommy.
What a joke.
Can you take him, please?
Yeah. Here. I got you. I got you.
Hey. What the fuck was that?
God damn it, Tommy. You know what we've been through.
I'll save it. She made me a promise.
I don't fucking care.
I know you don't, Dina. That's your goddamn problem.
Listen to me.
Oh yeah, I'm all fucking ears.
You don't come back here with that shit to my house ever again.
Dina is scolding Tommy, essentially for Jewish sins that Druckmann refuses to acknowledge openly, and would prefer instead to superimpose on the Gentile scapegoats. Something else Druckmann said in the Washington Post article really resonated with me. Quote, I landed on this emotional idea of, can we, over the course of the game, make you feel this intense hate that is universal in the same way that unconditional love is universal? This hate that people feel has the same kind of universality. You hate someone so much that you want them to suffer in the way they've made someone you love suffer, unquote. But is this kind of hatred that Druckmann felt after viewing the Ramallah killing really universal? What we're dealing with here is the fact that much of Jewish identity is centered on victimhood and vengeance, and it's been this way for thousands of years. It's 2020, and yet the Jews still haven't forgotten about the Amalekites, and it's doubtful that they're going to let go of the Holocaust anytime soon either. In fact, some Jews have opted to call down a curse upon us and our children if we forget it. Ironically, it's not the Gentile Ellie who needs to learn to walk away from the cycle of violence, it's the Jews, which is one reason why I take issue with Druckmann's use of Gentile avatars as scapegoats, while shielding Judaism from any direct criticism. Curiously, you literally can't shoot any religious items in the synagogue, and no, I didn't think to do this myself. I saw someone else's video on it and decided to test it out. I really have no desire to burn down a synagogue, but it does say something about Druckmann that the mere thought of someone shooting the Star of David in a virtual world enticed him to hardcode the game so that no one could. So to conclude, here's my basic summary of what I think the game does. It overtly affirms Jewish identity while quietly attacking other identities. It superimposes the dynamics of an ethnic Middle Eastern conflict onto a North American setting, while at the same time it pretends that there would be no racial divides in the US after an apocalypse. It's a truly bizarre notion of, yes, we'll all kill each other, but at least we won't be racist. Within the proxy IDF-WLF narrative, the game divorces the WLF from religious motivation, thereby absolving Judaism of a motivational role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In some ways, the game portrays annexation as regrettable, but inevitable because of Seraphite religious fanaticism. Insofar that it sympathizes with the Seraphites, it does so through a prism of apostasy and criticism, i.e., Yara and Lev suffered because they had a savage and backward culture, but now they're okay because they defected.
He's not one of them, please.
It condemns a father who refused to sacrifice his only child to strangers, and it ridicules anyone who wants to protect their community from sexual perversion. The game does all this with a veneer of an impartial exploration of cyclical violence and hatred. Now, maybe this was an honest attempt on Druckmann's part and it simply didn't live up to my ridiculous standards. But again, what's exceedingly frustrating is that while dozens of films and other media constantly celebrate Jewish vengeance as mitzvah, Druckmann felt he needed to use a bunch of white American avatars to explore cyclical violence.
I have a message for Germany. That you are all going to die. And I want you to look deep into the face of the Jew who is going to do it.
I mean, so what if Joel had a tribe that he gave preference to? Why is this a problem? As if Israeli preferences didn't already monopolize the American political landscape, Druckmann has now successfully inserted the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into the subconscious minds of millions of American gamers, and I argue that he did so in a disingenuous way. Unlike Druckmann, however, I've never had the desire to push a button and kill a bunch of people who've wronged me. I certainly don't want to make the Jews feel pain. If anything, I want them to make aliyah to Israel and live with the Palestinians in the same kind of peaceful and tolerant society they keep trying to force on everyone else.